So I'll not say anything more apart from the format, which is they're going to be reading sort of alternatively, and we'll also get to see some images on screen that illustrate what they're saying, and also then some clips towards a little bit further on down in the presentation of Des, and you'll sort of see some of the work that Stephen and Des have done together. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks everybody for coming. It was a wet, windy, late November evening. Thanks particularly to Marty and the Derry Centre for organising this event. The book was published some time ago, but I thought it was useful to try and share it with people in Derry. It's some content related to my growing up in this beloved city. Thanks also to Jenny Doherty, who from the bookshop in Derry, who's got some copies at the back, which I'm to sign, I'm told, and hopefully you're to buy. And lastly, but not least, thanks to Stephen Rea, who has been very supportive of filmmakers throughout his career, particularly younger filmmakers trying to do difficult things, do interesting things, work in different languages, work in the Irish language. So I'm very happy that he was able to come along tonight in his busy schedule and to help me out. What we're going to do is do a few readings. First part, Marty suggested that what I took as the object focus was the chapter that dealt with growing up in Derry in the 60s. That's a long time ago, and I see some people here who could probably remember it. But the book is much more extensive. It's about 40 years of living and writing, trying to make sense of how Ireland has changed in that time. And indeed, also how Germany has changed in that time as well, because I spent quite a lot of time in Germany. But let's start off with Derry, and let's start off with how basically we try and make sense of this in the writing task. Stephen, you can lead.
A health warning. What do social scientists write about when they write about themselves? We have all grown cautious of narratives of the authorial self, too often indulgent, prone to nostalgia and fabulation. Hero complex. Such life writing often ignores the social constraints and historical residues that determine an individual's life. The glue that fixes us, recollected experience needs supplemented with searching description. Recall placed in context, grudging acceptance of the contingency of memory.
60s dreams. The period in which I grew up in Derry in the 1960s was, for many young people, a curious make-believe one. A utopian period in some ways of European social democratic optimism and youthful dreams, before the crisis of the 70s signalled the end of a long post-war boom and the onset of the Troubles here.
Tremendous social advances were taking place in the north of Ireland, particularly in education. New levels of social awareness emerged. There was rock and roll on the jukeboxes, endless dancing, a new irreverence in popular culture, and a questioning of the status quo by young people. We felt we were entering a new world. At last we might transcend the narrowness and bitterness of the past. Dramatic changes in politics and culture were occurring elsewhere. The long march of labour and the spirited dance of youth.
Surely things would change here too.
In cultural terms, Derry was porous. As a port city, it seemed connected to a wider world out there. On its quays, you came across French sailors with their red pom-pom hats and acrid-smelling Gauloise cigarettes, strolling in the sun on leave from their frigates moored on Strand Quay. Black sailors from Portugal's African colonies were the first coloured people any of us had ever seen in the flesh. Further along the quays, timber boats from Scandinavia unloaded, the smell of pine resin in the air. Dockers landed coal from Durham, the sooty dust blown across the wooden piers and into your eyes. Baying and bewildered cattle were driven up rickety wooden gangways onto cargo ships for carriage to English abattoirs. Ship sirens sounded, marine engines purred, laden lorries bumped over cobbled tracks, gulls screeched overhead. Factory girls, arm in arm, strode home after their shifts, hair in curlers under colourful scarves, full of jip and in the mood for dancing. This was a town which, despite its widespread poverty and unionist political corruption, had an elevated view of itself as a part of the wider post-World War world on the move.
In the mid-60s, in pursuit of teenage kicks, I trod a city landscape of half-lit back streets, dockside wharfs, overgrown back lanes, abandoned warehouses, crumbling Victorian tenements, smoky basement bars, snooker halls. Young people were beginning to exploit the cracks that gradually appeared in the sectarian monolith, and there was a whole world out there to discover. Derry girls, happy to hang out with the lads from the bands, erotic encounters in dance halls and clubs, rainy street corners and deserted parks, often spiced by the frisson of class and cultural difference. In my teenage years, I spent more and more time with fellow musicians, most of whom were working-class Catholic backgrounds, rather than my middle-class compatriots. I started to distance myself from my culture of origin with its Puritan proprieties and undertow of sectarianism. Music was the escape. By its nature, music scene sought to rise above the sectarian divide. You were what you could play and what you could dream. It seemed to us that a modernizing wave was sweeping away the accumulated heritage of sectarian crap that we previously had to deal with. Perhaps we were over-optimistic. I began to practice and play in rock bands with my friends.
Now, at this time, the town was the location of an American naval communication base. With the Vietnam call-up in place, many young Americans had opted for naval service to avoid being sent to Vietnam with the army. Some found themselves serving Uncle Sam as landlocked sailors on the shores of Loch Foyle. They enjoyed a very relaxed form of military life, often living in apartments outside their base and socializing freely with local youth in the pubs and clubs of the town. They brought with them a broad range of American popular music, and we were able to hear the sort of music that wasn't easily available elsewhere in Ireland. Black sailors brought Chicago blues, Stax soul, Tamla Motown, and jazz. Their white counterparts brought the psychedelic rock of San Francisco and the new folk of Greenwich Village.
As young musicians, we lapped up this imported fare, borrowing records from our new American friends and swapping guitar riffs. We also played gigs on the naval base, where we found an enthusiastic audience for our home-brewed mixture of rhythm and blues, jazz, and rock.
A vibrant music scene developed around the new venues. The Enlisted Men's Club on the US base, the Casbah, Ken's Den, the Hayloft, and above all, the Go-Go Club, subsequently blown up by the IRA, ostensibly because it was judged to be a den of iniquity, corrupting local youth.
Certainly these were low-life dives that catered for American servicemen with money in their pocket and active libidos. But they hired the young musicians eager to pay the new forms of black-influenced music. Of course, these were not the sort of places you wanted your parents to find you being spotted in. I quite often had to sneak out of the family home with my younger brother, still only 14 years old, but prodigiously talented keyboard player, play a bluesy set on the Go-Go Club in the waterside docks, tiptoeing back in the house in the wee small hours. On one occasion, I discovered to my horror that our band was advertised in the Derry Journal for New Year's gig in the by now notorious Go-Go. I had to intercept my father's home-delivered copy of the Derry Journal, razor out the small ass page containing the incriminating model. Notice, my God, that was a close one.
The US naval base gave Derry its first real taste of American mass culture. Budweiser beer, pretzels, tuna and peanut butter sandwiches, Marlborough fags, bourbon whiskey, greenback dollar bills. However, transactions with Uncle Sam were not always without tension. The band were hired to play on the bass to entertain the children of the officers. Not their usual audience, many were quite young, more fans of the Monkees than Muddy Waters. But the money was good. After an uneventful first set that largely failed to spark the interest of the sub-teen audience, the band repaired to a backstage dressing room area in what was basically a large Nissan hut. The base had previously been a British Army camp. This housed a number of statues and assorted oak furniture covered in dust covers. But they thought little of it. The drummer had been sent to the KP store to buy some beers to wash down the tuna sandwiches provided by our hosts. Soon they were relaxing over their supper. This would be an easy evening. Suddenly the door to the Nissan hut was violently thrown open. In marched a squad of helmeted US military police bearing machine guns. Orders were barked to stand up. Show some respect. Then they were roughly spread-eagled against the wall. The MPs were clearly het up. But why? The sergeant in charge barked that we were guests on US territory and now unwelcome ones. Scum! We were guilty of an act of sacrilege. It appeared that the room we were enjoying our beers in was the sacristy of a temporary chapel. The irate sergeant pulled off the dust covers to reveal a huge statue of Our Lady, a large brass cross, and various other sacerdotal paraphernalia. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, muttered drummer Eugene, fearing the worst. Had we no common decency, interjected the sergeant in a high-pitched staccato scream. Hysterical. You're guilty of corrupting American minors by consuming alcohol in their vicinity.
We protested, but in vain. It was futile. The buttons were raised. We were escorted off the base in disgrace. We howled in our rage, and we cursed US imperialism from the safety of Limavady Road.
In the retelling of the story, the band presented themselves as the innocent victims of brutal Yankee imperialism. They demanded that the local branch of the Musicians' Union should boycott the US base. This got a lukewarm reception from the AMU. The base was too good a source of work for hungry Derry musicians. Besides, what would a bunch of largely Protestant posh grammar school boys know about real political issues?
Thus ended the first chapter in my political education.
But the dream could not last. Few of us grasped what was about to unfold.
70s realities. I remember being caught up in the rioting in Derry at the very beginning of the Troubles. The occasion was a large civil rights march through Derry on 5th October 1968. I recall seeing the leaders of the march jostling with the police, the roar of the crowd as the RUC officers surged forward with their batons and the marchers scattered. Next thing I was jumping over a low wall in Duke Street, out of the way of the impatching police, landing heavily on my ankle. I limped home to see the events I just witnessed relayed to the world via television news. I'm no longer certain of how I remember that day, whether as a personal, visceral experience of police brutality or via the flickering black and white images burnt into my memory. October the 5th, 1968 provided a rapid political education for me. A second chapter exploding in every direction. That night, after the march, I stood on the city walls and looked down on the angry crowds gathering in the streets of the Bogside below. It struck me that this was a turning point in the politics of Northern Ireland. I marked the start of some momentous event in the sense that the French philosopher Alain Badiou uses the term.
For Badiou, events are historically grounded in site-specific occurrences that involve an immediate intensity. This creates an instant expansion of political possibility for those who participate in the event. Through spectacle and engagement, events puncture the taken-for-granted character of the social world. They invite participants to adopt new political viewpoints. Only then does the excluded part of a society become visible. An event succeeds in representing a part which was previously unrepresented, without a voice. This revealing produces sudden new truths, new subjects, and radical political trajectories. The event is traumatic for the status quo, and exhilaratingly transformative for participants.
In school at the time, I'd been reading about the origins of the French Revolution and the storming of the Bastille in 1789. Now I was witnessing a real-life popular revolt. This was scary, but strangely exhilarating. Most of my school friends sympathised with the civil rights cause, and some of us were involved in the sit-downs in the Guildhall called as part of a strategy, non-violent strategy, to challenge the stormed regime seen as politically bankrupt. I can't think of anybody I knew who was really involved in Orangism at this time. Both irredentist nationalism and Orangism struck us as equally absurd and the product of a different time. We were into the new youth culture, both English beat music and American soul and blues. Our sensibilities were shaped by cultures of taste rather than of ethnic identity. We were mods, rockers, hipsters, punks, rather than unionists or nationalists. We were experiencing a generational rift. But then Derry was Derry.
Derry, a major market town serving the Donegal hinterland and drawing in workers to its shirt factories. A town with 4 railway stations, different lines snaking out into the counties of Derry, Antrim, Tyrone and Donegal. A busy port trading with the world and hosting the ships of various navies in war and peace. With 2 cathedrals, 5 cinemas, an opera house, a large department store, an imposing courthouse, a jail, and a walled asylum. It felt itself to be a proper city. Then, as now, it had attitude. Then, as now, it was rent with social division. Just behind the city walls lay a strip of grand historic buildings, all of them housing Protestant institutions. First Derry Presbyterian Church, the Apprentice Boys Memorial Hall, St Augustine's Church of Ireland Church, First Derry National School, the Masonic Hall, the Courthouse, and St Colum's Cathedral. On the other side of the walls lay Catholic Derry. Below, the Bogside with its cramped rows of terraces, and rising above it, the newly built Cregan Estate. Behind this lay the border and the hills of Donegal. Rarely does the topography of a town so perfectly reflect its sectarian division.
I had my own encounters with raw sectarianism. Derry was a town of Protestant and Catholic quarters in those days. Perhaps it still is. The Wolf Cubs I attended as a 9-year-old were met in a church hall adjacent to the city's walls. These 17th century defensive battlements were designed to protect the planter population from the natives whose land they had appropriated, of course. They retained a symbolic meaning for loyalists, but for us kids, they were an adventure playground. I knew every nook and cranny of them. But I was roughed up several times as a child when wearing my Cub uniform by older kids from the other side. One occasion, my scarf was ripped to shreds with a penknife, which came just a little bit too close to my throat for comfort. So for a while at least, I had a certain amount of trepidation when padding through certain areas of the town. Though to be honest, at the time, I had very little understanding of the animus that certain nationalists had with regards to the symbols of British royalty, or indeed why this had anything to do with me. As a family, we looked rather west than east. I grew up knowing relatively little about Northern Ireland. Most of my holidays and spare time was spent in Donegal, where my father seemed much happier and relaxed than anywhere in the north. My school was in effectively all Protestant one, but outside school I played and fought in gangs formed on the basis of street loyalties in the Meadowbank area rather than sectarian divisions. A hell of a lot of stone throwing, stick brandishing went on, but we fought and played with the kids of the surrounding streets untroubled by wider political tensions.
But Catholics and Protestants went to different schools. They worshipped in different churches and had separate cultural and sporting organisations. They voted for different parties, unionist and nationalist. They viewed social change differently.
The first film that I made tried to get at some of this stuff. We Fight No Surrender sought to explore the world of marching bands and the so-called siege mentality of loyalists. I began to use the new video technology and the students that I worked with when I was teaching at Dublin City University to map the subculture of loyalist youth, their bands, their street activities, the painting, the graffiti, the curb marking and aggressive territorialism. edited the footage of the marching season in Derry into a film around a retelling of the historical story of the siege. Channel 4 screened the film that eventually emerged.
We'll Fight at one point involves a reenactment, replaying the iconic moment in Loyalist history when Derry's fabled 12 apprentice boys seized the keys to the city's gates and rushed forward to slam the gates of the city in the face of the advancing Jacobite army sent by James II to seize the city for the Catholic cause, but with a twist.
During the shoot, a number of unemployed Catholic young men, hair-shaved in skinhead style, habitually hung around the city walls where we were filming. I asked them to reenact the shutting of the gate events by closing a modern security barrier then erected by the British Army within Magazine Gate. The modern metal gate was used to control vehicular traffic into the commercial centre of Derry in the context of the IRA bombing campaign of the period. After a bit of coaching, and an offer of payment of course, they agreed to restage the closing of the gates.
In an ironic reversal of roles, the Loyalists play the part of the besieging Jacobite forces, while the defenders of the Maiden City are played by the nationalist youth. These young apprentices, without trade, stand in for the rebellious youth whose defiance secured the city for the Protestant cause.
I'm just going to see a quick clip now from the film.
Misgivings about the political situation turned to blind panic at the imminent arrival of James Lieutenant the Earl of Antrim and his notorious Scottish mercenaries, the Redshanks. The reason was an anonymous letter in a semi-literate hand, which found its way to Derry. It was addressed to a leading Protestant noble and warned of a massacre planned by the Catholic Irish.
Good my lord, I have written to you to let you know that all our Irishmen through Ireland is sworn that on the 9th day of this month they are to fall on to kill and murder man, wife and child. Let no Irishman come near you whatsoever he be. So this is all from him who was your father's friend, and is your friend, and will be, though I dare not be knowledge yet for fear of my life.
Whatever the authenticity of this missive, few of those gathered in Derry for security were prepared to ignore its call to alarm. However, many of the commanding officers and leading citizens were reluctant to defy the authority of the king and his lieutenants, despite popular pressure to bar Antrim's move. Their uncertainty continued as the Redshanks reached the riverbank opposite the town and began to come across the River Foyle. The first ranks of Antrim's mercenaries advanced towards the main gate of the city. At the last moment, the paralysis of will of the garrison was overcome when a number of young men, most of them mere apprentices of the lower orders, drew their swords and seized the city keys from the main guard room. They rushed to secure the gate, slamming it in the astonished faces of the Redshanks. The celebration of the siege these days involves a massive security operation designed to allow the apprentice boys conduct their marches in what is now a predominantly Catholic town. The Catholic residents of Derry are not a little resentful of this invasion of their streets by thousands of loyalists still permitted by the British authorities to exercise their ancient right to occupation. Is it possible to have a non-sectarian celebration of the siege?
That's an interesting question. Answers please on postcards to the Northern Ireland Assembly. You can come again, Stephen?
I thought I did my bit.
I think you did do your bit.
I think you're supposed to say, I guess we were seeking to make past and present.
I think you're absolutely correct. I guess what we were trying to do was to get the past and the present to collide in interesting ways and envisage the possibility of reversal of roles. I think it was this is an anecdote. After I made this film, the effect of it was rather strange. I had a phone call from Gregory Campbell, the Right Honourable Gregory Campbell, asking me would I consider making a film for us. And I said, sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Who's this us you're talking about? I said, Gregory, you do, because I'd interviewed Gregory several times in research I was doing. Gregory, you do know my politics are not the slightest bit unionist. He said, we know that, but we think you're honest. Some backhanded compliment, I think. Now, the Protestant grammar school that I attended laid claim, rightly or wrongly, to being a liberal establishment, and I was encouraged to study Irish history. I spent a lot of time coping with the intricacies of this, our relation to England, the historical injustices that the Catholics have suffered, the complex role of the Protestant community within the national story, the political regression that unionism represented. I began to slowly realise that our tangled contemporary situation was basically still governed by an unresolved colonial situation. And sadly, that no amount of youth cultural rebellion was likely to change that. Yet, I retained this sense that music and youth culture could enable young people in the North to rise above the sectarian quagmire. In the late 70s, as the Troubles raged, we crowded into the Casbah bar to catch the undertones celebrating the birth of punk in the city. John T. Davis captured this moment in his pioneering film Shell Shock Rock.
Punk had a raw generational energy. It gave 2 fingers to the shibboleths of the sectarian society young people had been born into. It brought together young Protestants and Catholics. It imagined an alternative Ulster, even as the political violence spiraled out of control and the city became more and more divided. However, as the successful bands were sucked into the corporate music business, the force of punk as an indigenous counterculture capable of challenging sectarian ideology diminished. Punk became a subculture of escape rather than revolt.
Indeed, history often repeats itself. 20 years later, in my film Dancing on Narrow Ground, which dealt with rave culture, I explored if rave culture could be any more successful in challenging the sectarian status quo. Another quick quip. I don't know how successful the song was, but Kneecap used a bit of it in their last LP. They did. There you go.
Did they yuck that from you?
No, they didn't yuck it. They signed a contract.
When we go to the nightclub Kelly's, and it's just everybody's one big happy family. There's no animosity, no fighting. Nobody cares what religion you are, or where you're from, or what background you have.
Music brings you all together. Like, you've all got a common interest in music, so it brings you all together.
That summer they danced like they never danced before. They danced to drive away evil spirits. They danced to save their souls. They danced in the darkest hour that comes before the dawn. fire, we lived through some of our darkest moments in Northern Ireland. As the political violence spiralled out of control, the sectarian divide became wider and deeper. The young seemed to dance on ever narrower ground.
Reframing tradition. At school, I tried to study the Irish language, though I didn't succeed terribly well. A couple of faults. Perhaps I was rather more motivated by a teenage crush on an Irish-speaking Cregan lass than a disinterested love of the national language. Breeze was good enough to give me a well-thumbed copy of wknd, a primer in Irish, and fed me tales of Torrey Island, its High King, and his antics. My progress in the language was slow and not particularly encouraged by my school. However, I guess I did develop an interest in Gaelic culture and storytelling, and this orientation was useful years later when I started making films on a bilingual basis for the Irish language broadcaster TG4. Films such as Rahamor and Teal and Pasti Bio Bocht. And I was privileged to work with Stephen on these and some later projects.
You never said that.
The envelopes in the post.
How should documentary filmmakers picture the past? How should they conduct the struggle for memory? Clearly, a major resource for the representation of history and the celebration of popular memory is the treasure trove of archival images, both still and moving, now available to us online. But how should we make sense of this stockpile of images? As mute testimony of the past, or as a narrative resource capable of releasing the submerged voices of history and of attending to their story today?
Over the last number of years, I've developed an archivally based creative film practice exploring aspects of Ireland's post-famine past, including the Irish diaspora in America. Hard Road to Klondike, Rahamor and Teal, was adapted from Mickey McGowan's account of his upbringing in post-famine Donegal and subsequent travels as a migrant labourer, first in Scotland, then in the east part of industrial US, and then in the Montana, and finally in the Klondike, the name given to his book. The story was transcribed by the collector Shannon O'Hockey and later appeared in book form, then first in Irish and then in English translation. In the clip you're about to see, Mickey McGowan arrives in Montana after his time in industrial east, and he's involved in copper mining. He arrives there at the end of the Indian Wars, and he reflects on the parallels between the Irish experience of colonization and that of the Native Americans.
The valley below us was inhabited by Red Indians, and strange, rugged, featured men they were too, who gave their name to the river below us, the Great Blackfoot. Hundreds of battles between the Indians and the white men were fought in the surrounding countryside, and I'd often heard talk in the camps about Little Bighorn and Custer's defeat by Crazy Horse. The whole Nez Perce War had taken place some years earlier. Much of the fighting was down by the Bitterroot River, and that wasn't very far away from us. The Indians that were left here were in a bad way, and we had a great deal of pity for them. We knew their plight well, struggling to hold on to the land of their ancestors, with greedy white men trying to get their hands on it.
The Blackfeet people at the time that Mickey McGowan encountered them were going through a time of dreadful transition. The older order was breaking down. Their primary source of food, the buffalo, had vanished for all practical purposes. They were being settled in reservation communities, being oppressed by government agents.
Their squaws would come down to our cabins, leading mules holding 5 or 6 children, fitted snugly in panniers. They'd walk from cabin to cabin, and every bit of waste food we'd have thrown out, pieces of bread, discarded meat, they'd gather and take back with them down the valley.
They were trapped between their immediate old way of life and the uncertainty of a new way of life that we know, looking back from a distance 100 years later, has been a continual struggle. And so he was seeing a people that were going into a long decline, that even now, are struggling to regain some of their cultural and spiritual heights and integrity.
There was neither peace nor comfort for them anywhere. They'd come to a little valley pushed from their traditional lands by the settlers. They'd build their houses and start to work on the rough ground until they'd turn it into a fine, rich field stretching as far as the eye can see. Then the army would drive these poor people further into the remotest reaches of the hills. Often the soldiers had to fight a hard battle before the Indians would be finally defeated and routed. They'd hold out bravely, trying to keep their land and their way of life. But in the end, the white man's superiority of numbers and weapons would tell, and they'd suffer defeat. We were also interfering with them, I suppose, as well as everybody else, but at least some of us sensed that if they were bitter, it was not without cause.
That's the paradox of Mickey McGowan's narrative. On one hand, he's very empathetic. He's coming from a place of sorrow, of trial, of oppression, of colonialism. And he brings that baggage, obviously, of course, with him across the waters to Montana here and wherever else he traveled. So he can look through those eyes at the people here and be very empathetic. Yet, on the other hand, he was part of the larger society. He had no compunction, in other words, it didn't seem to me, no real second thoughts about about going ahead and being the oppressor as well.
A man from Cloughaneely, one of the O'Donnells, was out there at the same time as myself, and he had a fine, comely wife with him. They hadn't been very long in the place and didn't give any thought to the danger. He went off to the mines one day, leaving her behind in the cabin. A group of Blackfoot braves laid eyes on her and bore her off down the valley. When the man returned in the evening, there was neither hide nor hair of his wife. The poor man was nearly out of his mind. It was clear to the old hands that the red men had kidnapped her. The anger of the miners mounted, and they gathered with their guns and set off down the valley to look for her. They intended to wreak havoc and desolation on the Indian. As they came to the Indian camp, they saw the lost woman sitting dazed among a crowd. As soon as the Indians saw us coming towards them, armed to the teeth, off they made like rabbits, leaving her behind. I was one of the band that rescued that poor woman, and I didn't care whether I was shot, as long as we got her away from those red devils.
McGowan's personal story speaks to a wider experience of colonized and marginalized peoples and of their diasporic experience. It does so not only via the story of his passage to the New World, but in his troubled account of his encounter with the native peoples that migrants like him were displacing from their homelands in the Rocky Mountain West. Indeed, It is McGowan's capacity as a storyteller to lift his narrative out of the sentimental reminiscence of the Irish emigrant, to address the issues of solidarity and difference between his experience as a Gael and that of the Indians, which makes his book so powerful.
My next film, The Last Storyteller, focuses on the life of the folklore collector Shannon O'Hoy, who recorded Mickey McGowan's story alongside hundreds of other recordings of the last generation of Shannikin in Donegal. The film is in part a homage to Sean, and in part a critical and imaginative retelling of some of the key tales collected by him. Stephen again provided the voiceover. Stephen had worked with Neil Jordan and Jordan's film Company of Wolves, itself an adaptation of the Gothic tales respun by the novelist Angela Carter in her feminist reading of classic folklore. The film was produced by Margot Harkin from Derry, and like Hargo de Klondike, was selected for the Venice Film Festival.
Long ago, a lot of women used to go to Falcara to sell buttermilk. There would often be 10 or 12 churns of milk at the cross and a great demand for it. One day, the women were at the cross as usual selling the milk. Among them was a girl from Cashel-na-Gor who had a churn in a donkey cart. She was standing in the cart with a measure in her hand to sell to anybody who came to her. And the wind brought a ship from the south. The boat tied up below at the pier, and her cargo was unloaded. Two of the crew walked up to the cross where the women were, and one of them turned to the girl from Cashel-na-Gor and asked what price her buttermilk was. "Penny a quart," says she. "All right," says the sailor. "Give me a quart of it, I'm thirsty." The girl handed him the quart of milk and he gave her a penny. He put the can to his mouth and drank the milk while the other sailor looked on. He was sitting on her cart and he wiped his mouth with the corner of her apron. The two sailors then went off down the street. What did the girl do but jump off the cart and away after the sailor who had wiped his mouth on her apron? Whenever the sailors went into the public house, she followed them and stood right close to the sailor who had touched her apron. Nobody could separate them. Soon tongues began to wag and eyebrows were raised. Later on in the day, an uncle of hers heard what had happened. He went straight into the public house where the three of them were standing at the counter. took out his knife and cut the string of her apron. It fell to the ground. The uncle picked up the apron, took it into the kitchen and shoved it into the centre of the fire. He stood there till it was burnt. No sooner did it fall than the girl went off out the door of her own accord and went back to her cart and churn. All that were at the fire couldn't separate her from the sailor until the apron was cut off her. May God guard us all.
A tale of desire expressed and repressed. Right, that's the end of our presentation. I'd just like to point out that the book, as well as containing all the essays, also has links to all the films which can be seen via the passwords in the book. So it's a bargain buy. Okay, thanks Stephen again. And that's all the time.
I meant to say at the beginning, sorry, look, Jenny's here with some books, and Des will sign them as well if anyone wants to get a copy.